Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and tonight on Forgotten Mysteries, I have for you The Singing Bone by R. Austin Freeman. This is copyright 1965 by Norton. It's a part of their reprint series, the Norton, what does it say here? The Norton Library of Mystery and Suspense. A little hard to read the blue against the black there. Very cool cover, very cool colors. But as I mentioned, it is a reprint. It was originally published in 1912 in London by Hodder and Stoughton. And I'll show you a little something interesting about the book. It came with a sort of a sticker inside on the inside front cover. And it's so in sync with the art for the book, I have to assume that it was, came with the original book, and the artwork is so in tune with the title of The Singing Bone. I just thought this is interesting. You don't see a lot of that, in hardcovers. And then there's the Seagull Library of Mystery and Suspense right there on the front board. So R. Austin Freeman has quite a reputation in mystery circles, and I had not read him before, so I was really excited to get a copy of this book. Let me tell you a little bit about the author, then we'll get into the book and its pros and its cons. So the author himself was a doctor and quite learned, very much a researcher, worked as a doctor in prisons, worked in the military, got invalided out of the military, and then really turned to writing more for a permanent source of income. And the reason he is so well known and regarded, or one of the reasons, is that he is considered to be the creator, the founder of what's called the inverted detective stories. And by that I mean, there are 5 stories in this book, and I'll tell you a little bit about them later on. But they, all but one of them, follow the same format, which is, in part 1 of the story, you see the crime being committed. You see the perp, you see the victim, you see how the perp knocks off the victim or tries to knock off the victim or tries to pull some kind of crime. And then that part ends. And then in part 2, Freeman's series character, Dr. John Thorndyke, comes in as investigator. And his job is to figure out who done it by virtue of the clues and the evidence that was left behind during the crime. So what Dr. Thorndyke is, he's not really a detective or a policeman. He is a forensics expert. And so pretty much all of his investigations detail the very fine pieces of evidence left behind by the perpetrator. And with his vast store of knowledge and his lab equipment, he is able to trace the crime directly back to the perpetrator. So that's sort of interesting, right? So you're really reading the same story twice. You're reading it first as it moves forward. The plot moves forward and the crime is committed. And then part 2, you're moving backwards. You're moving with Dr. Thorndyke being brought in and his working back through the scene of the crime to find out who done it. So a very interesting idea. It's been used by some later writers, some contemporary writers I can think of, where they'll tell a story from one character's point of view, and then in the next chapter they'll switch to telling the same events from a different character's point of view. And that's a little tricky. I understand kind of the writerly instinct to do that, because it would be a great way to to differentiate character or build character, to see how different people view different scenarios in different ways or interpret things differently. But the real worry here is that you're going to sound repetitive or repetitious, which I just was by saying repetitive and repetitious in the same sentence. So you kind of have to be aware of that and have some tolerance for that. Basically, what Dr. Thorndyke does is, I guess I would consider it, I'm not an expert in this, except, in the area of reading fiction, that these books are probably some of the earliest that really dig deeply into what we think of as forensics today, right? This very careful examination of the crime scene and, picking hairs out of the carpet with a tweezer and, doing blood samples and splatter examinations and, footprint analysis and all these things that are really kind of the maybe I would say the basis of modern law enforcement or the modern justice system. So I'm a little bit of two minds about that. One is that it's really fascinating to read about in this book, to read about the early days of this and to see the progression from the old sort of what we're used to as sort of the Hercule Poirot school of investigation, where he's looking at motives and examining scenes and examining inconsistencies in people's testimony. All those, I guess you'd kind of consider them maybe psychological dimensions of the puzzle. Whereas in Freeman's books, it's really all about the minutia of the crime scene. And so there's some really cool things about Dr. Thorndyke. He carries around with him what he calls his research case. It's a little, satchel, almost like an attaché case where he's got all the stuff he needs to do a criminal investigation on the fly. So he's got a sort of a miniature microscope and slides and eyedroppers and test tubes and various chemicals and rulers and like all of the early instruments of forensics. And he makes use of them. He's a very thorough, extremely thorough investigator. But his parts of the story are not told by him. They're told by his colleague, Dr. Christopher Jervis, who is sort of like his, maybe like a junior partner in terms of their practice. So Dr. Jervis knows plenty, but he is still learning at the feet of the great Dr. John Thorndyke, who is a pleasant man, very, when I say monotone, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that he's pretty unflappable and, is, always very willing to explain why other people, especially the police, have misinterpreted a crime scene or misinterpreted evidence. And then he whips out his chemistry set and his vast knowledge and shows what really happened. So the most famous story in this book, like I said, there are 5, it's called The Case of Oscar Brodsky. And that is about a man who lives alone, who is a jewel thief. And he's very, very DL about it. He doesn't do major heists, or he doesn't, he never wants to really call that much attention to himself. But one night, just by coincidence, a fellow diamond dealer is walking to the train station and it takes place in England, of course, and basically passes by this diamond thief. His name is Silas Harker. Passes Harker's house. Harker invites him in. He recognizes the man. The man does not recognize Harker because he doesn't have his glasses on. And Harker knows if this man is traveling to Amsterdam, it is to sell jewels. And he just can't help himself. He has to kind of, it's kind of interesting to see the criminal mind at work where he argues with himself, no, I should not kill this man in my house. That's not a good idea, just to get his diamonds. But he can't help himself. He does it. He thinks he finds a very clever way to get rid of the body, to make it look like it was an accident or suicide. And in steps, and we watch all this happen. And then in steps Dr. Thorndyke with the aid of Dr. Jervis, and they backtrack until they find Silas Harker to be the criminal, and it's all been done very, very forensically with little bits of evidence like pieces of glass and grains of sand or grass, and the position of the body, and all these things that really, I think, make people who are oriented to forensics really kind of excite them about looking at a crime scene and kind of developing an instinctive feeling for what happened based just on looking at what's going around them. But again, as I mentioned, the evidence is often microscopic as well. So Dr. Thorndyke pulls out his trusty mini microscope, and begins solving the tale. The other stories in here, one is about a blackmailer, one is about a murder at a lighthouse, one is about an assault and battery that takes place at a spinster's ball. I didn't know that such a thing occurred, but apparently it did. And one in which an excellent set of fingerprints clearly points to one culprit, but the culprit had nothing to do with it. So the question is, how did this perfect set of fingerprints get at the crime scene and other pieces of physical evidence that point directly to this man who we know did not do it, and who Thorndyke knows did not do it. So there's a fair amount of different kinds of crimes committed in here. I guess I would call the 5 of them short stories. They're not, they're maybe like 40, 50 pages each. Not quite novellas, maybe bordering on novellas, but I think probably I would call them short stories. And the title, The Singing Bone, it's a really cool title. And what it comes from is an old piece of folklore, which I will read to you. It's about a man who finds a bone, and he decides to make a musical instrument out of it. And when he tries to play the instrument sings its own song. It sings, "My brother slew me and buried my bones beneath the sand and under the stones." So the singing bone is the metaphor for the physical evidence left behind that tells the story. So that's kind of a nice touch. Okay, so sorry for that weird fade out. My phone rang while I was making the video, and I didn't know how to juggle my various pieces of technology to keep talking and turn the phone off. So here I am with part 2, but within the same video. I hope I can combine them without too much technological agita. So I think I've given you a sense of what the book is like. Let me tell you now a little bit about my own impressions of the format and the writing. First of all, I thought that there was a nice combination of stories in here, that they weren't all about finding a murderer. There were different types of crimes that had different types of outcomes. In one, there's no murder or death at all. It happens in a story where a man kind of who's a criminal crashes a spinster's ball pretending to be somebody else. He meets a woman, an American woman whom he had dallied with many years ago, and He promises to meet her later on in the garden, but when he goes to meet her, he's tempted by all of her jewels. So he chloroforms her and she kind of rolls down the hill, but she survives. And the story becomes about trying to find the person who chloroformed her. How are you possibly going to find this one man in England, based on really a very tiny amount of clues? But of course, Thorndyke does it. So there's really clever detection in here. Not detection, though, that we as readers would be able to do on our own. And I think that Freeman knew that. That's why he gave us all of the information up front. I think his goal was more to impress us with the forensics work, and it is indeed impressive. I don't know a lot about forensics, but it all seems pretty well documented. And I learned also that Freeman had an actual laboratory in his house where any type of evidence that he used in the book or in his crimes, he tested first in his own lab to make sure it would work. So how is that for true research, right? I guess a lot of writers, including me, think of research as going to a library and scribbling notes, but here's a man who actually worked with forensic techniques to make sure that his books were as true as possible. So that's something that I think is a really positive aspect of the book and will give forensics types quite a thrill. I personally am not that much into forensic solutions to crimes. I don't know why. I guess, I know they're important in real life, but I like more like the psychological aspect of crimes and clues and like the type of traditional detection that has been done in fiction, right? In real life, if DNA is going to find the killer or save someone from the electric chair, I'm all for it. But in fiction, I would say forensic stuff is not normally my chosen poison. Pardon the pun, but here I liked it because I don't read about it that much, and each story does not overstay its welcome. It's kind of in and out. I liked Dr. Thorndyke. It's always easy to admire someone who's very, very good at what he does, and he and his colleague Dr. Jervis get along very well. They have a nice relationship. Nothing special. You don't see sparks of chemistry flying between them, but they're good, solid colleagues who help each other. So I like that. I think the writing is good. Freeman was a very good observer, and as in so many books that I've read, mysteries that take place in England, Englishness and the English countryside and descriptions of England are portrayed and given in very vivid detail, where you feel like you are there. There seems to be a love of country in the English novel that we don't get so much in the United States, or at least not that I've seen. Maybe because we're such an enormous country and our identities are more regional than United Statesian or American. But that's really nice. I mean, there's some really cool things in here where, the American woman whose jewels tempt the bad guy, she says, the police get called in and, she gets all, up in arms. I mean, I guess today we would call her a Karen. And she says to the police force, you know what? If this was America and you were American men, you would have found the guy and you would have clubbed him over the head and dragged him off to the prison and sent him to the electric chair already. And the investigators are like, whoa, we are not Americans. We are Englishmen. This is England. And this is how we do things here. Don't expect American treatment here. And that was a nice point of contrast, right? Because she's sort of the victim of harumphs, like, oh, all this English civility. It's so passe when, Americans know how to really handle a crime, so much better. So that's another nice thing about the book. There are a couple things that I would say were less appealing to me. Is that I'm not really a big short story reader. I don't know why. They don't usually they don't hold my attention as much as full-length novels. So I haven't read a lot of short story collections of mysteries. I've read Charlotte Armstrong's collections. They're fantastic. I read Baroness Orczy's book, The Man in the Corner, and that is a collection of short stories that are all sort of tied together. And that was good. But again, lots of short stories. And then this one was I felt like just enough to give me an orientation to Dr. Thorndyke. But I wished that I had had more to grab onto, right? More to, to feel like I could sink my teeth into a full novel instead of stories. But if you like stories or you like shorter fiction, I think this book may be for you. Here's one of the trickier parts, is that there is definitely snobbery in here. And whenever I read a book in which snobbery plays a role, or other social mores, or anything social, you see what happens. And for me, the question is always whether the author approves of it or does not approve of it, right? And I don't think that a lot of readers today can draw that distinction, right? They see the presence of something negative as the author's endorsement of that negative aspect instead of the author's critique of that negative aspect. So what's in here is a lot of class snobbery and intellectual snobbery of looking down on people beneath one in a social hierarchy, implying that the lower you are in the social hierarchy, the lower your IQ. So there's sort of like an uncomfortable flirting with eugenics going on in here. And I believe Freeman himself, the writer, flirted with some eugenics studies. So, that can get really scary really, really quickly. So it's subtle-ish, but I think if you're sensitive to that kind of stuff, you should, just be on the lookout for it. The first person narration done by Dr. Jervis he's not only conveying Thorndyke's snobbery, he's also conveying his own. Another interesting thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that Thorndyke he's not a policeman. So justice, or bringing the criminal in and seeing that he or she gets his just desserts, is not really his thing. He's like, okay, you hire me, I bring my research case, I tell you what happened, and then you, the police, take it from there. You figure out what happens. So in one case, there's, and this isn't really a spoiler, there is a blackmailer who gets it. And, one thing I have learned from reading mystery fiction is if you really want to die, start blackmailing somebody, because it is the best groundwork, the best recipe for murder you can ask for. Just start blackmailing somebody. And at the end of that story, they say, well, we're kind of glad the murderer got away with it because the blackmailer deserved it. He got what was coming to him. Then in another story, the victim does not want to prosecute. And Thorndyke is like, live and let live. I told you what happened. We all figured it out. We tied this plot, this story up in a tiny little package. And now whatever happens, the jurisprudence system is up to you. So I guess, I never really read, I should be ashamed to admit this, I never read any of the Scarpetta novels by Patricia Cornwell. And I know they're very heavily forensic. And that's part of the reason why I never really read them, because that's not my kind of thing. So I don't know how much justice is important in those books. But in here, it isn't so much. It's more about the intellectual use of the surroundings and chemistry and biology and physics and all and the other sciences, forensic sciences, to dig down into what happened. The writing was good. Not. I can't say that it blew my socks off, but I thought that it was, these stories were well told and they were the right length. They didn't, keep blathering on, which, for me that's kind of the kiss of death. I like to show you, in a lot of these reprints, what they do is they pick up the printing plates from the older books. So what you see is a vestige of how typography was done years earlier. So this book was published in the 60s, but it picked up printing plates from 1912. And just take a look at the way the type is set. You can see each line was probably set individually. The space between the words is not well equalized. The type only takes up a relatively small amount on the page, right? There's pretty large margins. So that was fun to read, something that was that looked like it had been published in 1912 as it was published then. So I think that's all I've got for you tonight. I've got The Singing Bone by R. Richard Austin Freeman, featuring Dr. John Thorndyke, forensic pathologist, and his very, very painstaking and intellectual way of investigating crime. Not a lot of humor, not a lot of action, not a lot of character building. He's competent in all these areas, but the short story doesn't often allow you to really dig deeply into any of those things. And so serviceable for what the stories did. But like I said, I like a little bit more heft. But I wanted to read a Dr. John Thorndyke book. He has a very famous one called The Red Thumb Mark, which I will read someday. It's another Freeman book, very well regarded, but it's a full-length novel instead of a collection of short stories. And that is it for tonight. I think this may be one of my first videos of 2026. I make them, and I don't want to overexpose myself, so I don't post them all when I make them. So I've got a backlog. So I don't even know when this is going to show up on the channel, but I hope sometime in 2026. Okay, thank you. Happy New Year, even if by accident this ends up getting posted in March. And I will see you next time.